This happened several years ago when my family and I decided to visit my aunt and uncle's house to celebrate Thanksgiving. They had a large and spacious house, perfect for hosting many people during family occasions. It wasn't unusual since most of our family gatherings were held there. That house, thanks to its size and comfortable atmosphere, could accommodate everyone with ease. On that day, I remember we arrived a bit early, and I spent a long time in the living room, sitting in front of the large television, watching a football game. I was surrounded by some relatives, and everyone was enthusiastic, watching the screen and reacting to every move. While we were in the living room, some other family members had gathered in the adjacent dining room. They were sitting around the tables, chatting and laughing, and their voices would reach us from time to time. The atmosphere was cozy and full of the familiar warmth typical of such occasions. But suddenly, everything changed. I started to hear whispers coming from the dining room. I strained my ears to listen and discovered that the conversation was about something strange. A man, a stranger, standing in the yard. At first, I wasn't sure what I had heard, so I tried to listen more carefully. It seemed that someone had seen a person who didn't belong there. This was truly strange. My aunt and uncle's house was on a very large property in a quiet area. Their neighborhood wasn't gated, but it gave off a sense of privacy because of the large spaces between the homes. It was never common to see anyone wandering randomly around the properties. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to get up and head to the window. From there, I could barely make out someone moving in the yard. He was walking slowly toward the house. Then, suddenly, he disappeared from sight. I felt uneasy. There was another window overlooking the backyard, but I didn't want to move alone. I went toward the sliding glass door leading to the basement, only to find out later that it was securely locked. Fortunately, the man couldn't get in. By this time, everyone in the house had heard about the stranger. Almost every person at the Thanksgiving gathering was discussing what had happened, trying to make sense of the situation. After a while, we saw the man moving again. This time, he was walking away from the house, heading back toward the road, before disappearing behind a large tree. We assumed he had finally left. However, the unease lingered. None of us knew who this person was or why he had been there. As the clock neared 5 p.m. and the sun began to set, we returned to our usual activities. It was as if everything had gone back to normal, but the strange feeling didn't leave me. Not even an hour had passed when we suddenly heard a knock at the front door. A shiver ran down my spine when I realized it was the same man. My uncle, who appeared tense, went to the door and opened it. I tried to listen to their conversation, but I couldn't hear much. Shortly after, my uncle returned and told us that the man had apologized, saying he had come to the wrong address. He claimed he was looking for a friend's house to celebrate Thanksgiving and had mistakenly thought it was my uncle's house. But we didn't believe his story. His behavior was far too suspicious, especially since he had tried to enter through the back door first. Why hadn't he come to the front door from the beginning? That question kept repeating in my mind. I thought the story ended there, but I was wrong. Later that night, as I returned to watching football, I suddenly heard someone ask, "Is the man back?" I jumped up from my seat. This time, I couldn't stay seated. I walked into the dining room, where I found my mom and one of my aunts sitting near the table by the window. My aunt gestured towards something in the darkness. There, at the edge of the woods that bordered the backyard, stood a person. He seemed to be staring at the house. The woods were far from any neighboring property, which made his presence there even more strange. He stood there for minutes, unmoving, as if he was trying to figure something out or gather the courage to do something else. Then after about 5 minutes, he finally moved, but his movement wasn't normal. Suddenly, he started running, sprinting across the yard until he vanished from sight. That was the last time anyone saw him that night. For the rest of the evening, the man didn't reappear, and I never heard anything about him again after that. Every Thanksgiving, our large family would gather together for a special event that brought everyone together. It wasn't just about celebrating the holiday. It was also the perfect opportunity for an annual family reunion. This gathering was always held at my aunt's house, as it was the largest among the family homes and perfectly suited to accommodate the large number of attendees. Yet, even with its size, the house would become quite crowded due to the sheer number of relatives who came every year. After dinner, the children would usually separate from the adults and head to different areas of the house, either upstairs or to the basement, where they could play freely without disturbing the grown-ups. As for me, I would spend some time with the kids, but not many of my cousins were close to my age. This often led me to gravitate towards spending more time with the adults. I enjoyed their company because they always told funny stories and shared moments full of humor and laughter. However, one particular night, something unusual caught my attention. My Uncle Bobby had stepped outside for a smoke, and when he came back inside, there was a strange expression on his face, something I couldn't quite understand. He looked tense, and his smile seemed noticeably forced. It was easy for me to pick up on this because I knew that both Uncle Bobby and my dad had served in the military, and they both had that unmistakable look, the kind that suggested something was bothering them deeply. My curiosity got the better of me, and I approached him. I tugged on his arm and started pestering him with questions, refusing to let up until he finally gave in and pulled me aside to explain what was on his mind. He pointed across the street to an old house. It was a house I had heard about my entire life. Every time we visited my aunt's home, the adults would always warn me to stay away from it or even think of going near it. Uncle Bobby revealed to me that the house was old and abandoned, and that he, my dad, and a couple of their friends had explored it when they were younger. What surprised me even more was that they were considering exploring it again that very night. I couldn't contain my excitement and began begging them to let me come along. Perhaps I annoyed them enough to make them agree, or maybe they just thought nothing serious would happen. The house stood there, looming like a faded shadow of the past. It was a dilapidated two-story structure, built in the style of the 1950s. The paint had peeled off the walls, giving it an eerie appearance. As we approached and entered the house, I immediately noticed that the walls were covered with strange drawings. They didn't look like typical graffiti. They seemed deliberate, as if they had been carefully planned and sketched. Uncle Bobby led us into the kitchen, and there we encountered a sight that sent chills down my spine. In the center of the room was a pentagram drawn on the floor, surrounded by animal carcasses. The carcasses were fresh, looking no more than a day or two old. The smell was overpowering, so foul and nauseating that I felt my stomach turn. At that moment, I realized I might have made a big mistake by insisting on coming along. Despite this, the adults were adamant about checking out the basement, so I reluctantly followed them. I already wanted to leave, but there was no turning back now. Bobby led us to a narrow staircase hidden behind a wall, and we began our descent. The basement was dark, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene upstairs. Scattered across the floor were cans of food, along with several makeshift sleeping mats, suggesting someone had been living there recently. In the center of the basement was a small propane heater, casting a dim glow that added to the unsettling atmosphere. In one corner, there was a pile of bones. I tried to convince myself they were chicken bones, but the truth wasn't clear, and I wasn't entirely sure. With the carcasses upstairs and the scattered items in the basement, it became evident that someone had been living or at least staying in this house. Eventually, the adults agreed it was time to leave. We had only been there for about 5 minutes or less, but it felt like hours. As we exited through the front door, I could have sworn I heard faint footsteps coming from the second floor above us. We quickly made our way back to my aunt's house, and the rest of the night passed uneventfully. However, years later, I learned the truth about that house. It turned out that there had been a cult operating in the area. Members of the cult were known to break into farms and steal small livestock for their bizarre rituals. But the most horrifying part of the story involved a woman from the cult who had reportedly gone insane and started abducting people from the area. I don't remember the woman's name, but people in the community had taken to calling her the Wicked Witch of the East. Eventually, authorities managed to capture 2 of her accomplices, but as far as I know, she herself was never caught. It's possible that the house we entered wasn't hers, but rather a place used by other, less dangerous members of the cult. Either way, that night remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. For all I know, we might have unknowingly crossed paths with the Wicked Witch of the East that night. Thanksgiving at our home is always a special occasion. My wife and I live in our cozy home, and every year we host family members, including our parents, siblings, and some aunts and uncles. The atmosphere of the holiday is always warm and intimate, with between 15 to 20 people gathered around one table. It's a perfect opportunity to strengthen family bonds and enjoy shared memories. I remember that last year was similar to previous years in terms of the arrangements. Relatives began arriving early in the afternoon, and as time went by, the house gradually filled with conversations, laughter, and the sound of footsteps. I was busy greeting guests and helping my wife in the kitchen, where the delicious smells of food filled the air. At one point, I left the kitchen and entered the living room to take a quick look at the atmosphere. I was surprised to see a strange face in the crowd. It was a man I didn't know at all, standing quietly among the guests and looking around as if trying to familiarize himself with the place. I felt very confused. Who was this man, and why was he here? I approached my uncle, who was standing nearby, and asked him quietly, "Who is this person? Do you know him?" My uncle answered with strange confidence. He came at the same time we did. He said he's a close friend of yours, so we thought he was invited. I was stunned by his response and quickly said, "I don't know him at all." I felt that the situation was starting to get uncomfortable. I decided to handle the situation myself, either asking the man to leave or at least finding out why he was in my house. I started walking toward him, but just as I was about to reach him, the man made eye contact with me and then began walking away. He walked toward the stairs and went upstairs, leaving everyone in the living room without any explanation. A strange sense of danger overtook me. I quickly followed him up the stairs, driven by a concern I couldn't explain. When I reached the top, I found that all the doors were closed just as they had been before. I stood in the dark hallway and called out loudly, "Who's there?" but received no response. I approached the first door, which was a guest bedroom. I slowly opened it and looked inside, but I didn't find anyone, just the furniture neatly arranged as usual. I felt frustrated, but I didn't give up. I exited the room and went back into the hallway. I walked toward our bedroom door, and when I tried to open it, I found it locked from the inside. I was certain the strange man was inside the room. I knocked firmly on the door, trying to sound authoritative. "Open the door. Who are you?" But once again, there was no response. I quickly went back downstairs to where my wife and some relatives were still in the living room. I told them what had happened, and the look of shock was clear on their faces. We decided that the best course of action was to call the police, especially since we didn't know the man's intentions or whether he posed a danger. We waited anxiously for the police to arrive, while the man stayed locked in the bedroom. He didn't try to leave or speak, which only heightened our tension. When the police arrived, they went upstairs and spoke with him through the door. After several minutes, they managed to convince him to come out. The man seemed strangely calm, as though he didn't realize the severity of what he had done. To this day, I still don't understand why he was in our home or how he even got in. It was a strange and frightening situation, but it taught me to be more cautious in the future, even during the most familiar and safe occasions. Thanksgiving had always been a warm family occasion at my grandparents' small farm. I used to look forward to these gatherings eagerly during my childhood, but as the years went by, I began to feel that those gatherings had become increasingly boring and repetitive. I was a teenager now, and as I grew older, my feelings of boredom grew stronger toward the endless chatter of the adults. They talked about things I found uninteresting at the time. I remember one particular year, after the early Thanksgiving dinner, I felt a sense of boredom creeping in. The voices around me overlapped, and the conversation was not getting any more exciting, so I decided I needed some time alone, away from the crowd. I calmly told my parents that I was going to take a little walk around the property to get away from the repetitive atmosphere. They didn't object. I had always enjoyed spending time outdoors every now and then. It helped me relax and gave me a way to escape the feelings of discomfort I was experiencing at that moment. I just wanted to enjoy a quiet time outside, away from the tedious conversations inside the house. I set off across the land, heading towards the place I used to love exploring when I was younger, the old barn at the far end of the farm. The barn brought back many memories, even though my grandparents no longer used it as they did in the past. The barn had originally been used to store old farming tools and equipment, but it no longer housed any animals like it once did. I knew that no one would be looking for me in this remote spot, so I felt a sense of freedom as I walked through the surrounding atmosphere. When I arrived at the barn, I discovered it was in a very old condition. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, but surprisingly, it was easy to push open. It struck me as odd that my grandparents never locked the door, but I realized they didn't need to lock it. There was nothing of value inside that could attract attention. I easily opened the door and stepped inside. Inside the barn, the darkness was complete, as if the shadows surrounded the place from every angle. Although I knew I was in a familiar spot, there was an air of mystery that hung in the space. I took out my phone and switched on the flashlight, which cast a dim glow around the room, revealing many old tools stacked here and there. These tools were covered in rust, and the air was thick with cobwebs hanging from the rafters, like ancient decorations. There was something both thrilling and eerie about exploring the barn, surrounded by neglected belongings and the pervasive darkness. As I walked among the old tools, something small caught my eye on the workbench, an old axe. It was no ordinary axe. It was rusty and covered in dried blood that looked like it had been there for a long time. Immediately, I recalled how my grandparents used to butcher animals on the farm years ago. It didn't seem unusual to see such a tool there, even though the dried blood made me feel uneasy. Still, it wasn't enough to deter me from continuing my exploration. I kept moving deeper into the barn, continuing to explore its dark corners until I reached the stairs leading up to the loft. The loft was filled with old hay. At first, I found nothing of interest, and I was about to turn back when my foot accidentally stepped on something beneath the hay. I shifted some of the hay aside with my foot, and what I uncovered almost made my heart stop. Beneath the hay was something dark and horrifying, the empty eye sockets of a long-dead corpse staring up at me from the darkness. Its hollow eyes gazed at me without expression, as if it were looking straight into my soul. A sudden chill ran through my body. I left everything behind and ran as fast as I could back to the house. When I entered, I was gasping for breath, and I immediately told everyone what I had found in the barn. My father and uncle, initially in shock, quickly came with me to confirm what I had discovered. Once they verified it, my grandparents immediately called the sheriff. The investigators confirmed that the body had been in the barn for about 3 years, with several hatchet wounds to it. During the investigation, the disturbing realization hit me. I had actually touched the very axe when I was going through the old tools earlier. It made my mind race with terror. How had I picked up the murder weapon without realizing it? My grandparents and parents were also in shock. They had lived on the farm for years without knowing that there was a dead body in the barn all that time. They couldn't identify the body, except that it was a man. The investigation dragged on for months, but no leads surfaced, and even to this day, no one knows who killed him or why. It was during my college years, and every year I would return home to celebrate Thanksgiving. Those moments were always a warm social gathering, where we would head to my grandparents' house with a bunch of other family members. But this year was a bit different. Before meeting up with my family, I decided to visit my high school friend on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. It was a usual tradition for us to reminisce and talk about our school days. After finishing the visit with my friend, I was on my way back home when my mom texted me asking if I could pick up a few items from the supermarket. It wasn't a big deal, so I stopped at the nearest store. It was around 6 p.m. when I arrived, and as soon as I entered the store, I was surprised to see how crowded it was. It seemed like everyone had decided to shop at the same time. I had no choice but to park my car at the farthest end of the parking lot, then walked into the store, thinking about the items I needed to buy. I didn't have a long shopping list, just a few things that I wasn't exactly sure where to find. So I started walking down the aisles, searching for them. But something caught my attention in a very strange way. Despite the crowd, I noticed a woman standing at the edge of the store near the frozen food section. She was staring at me in a very unsettling manner, almost as if she was scrutinizing me with an intense gaze. It was uncomfortable because I didn't recognize her at all. I looked away and continued with my shopping. However, when I moved to another section of the store, I was surprised to see the same woman again. She was standing there, seemingly doing nothing but staring directly at me once more. I felt even more confused and uneasy, wondering what was going on. I didn't want to approach her or ask what was happening, so I decided to focus on finishing my shopping as quickly as possible. The store was still very crowded, which made it take longer than usual to gather everything I needed. Eventually, I got everything on my list, went to the checkout, and paid. While waiting in line, I didn't see the woman who had been watching me, and I thought maybe the strange encounter had ended. After leaving the store, I walked to my car, placed the groceries in the back, and got into the driver's seat. I started the engine when I suddenly heard a knock on the passenger side window. I looked over and saw the same woman from the store. She was standing by my car, knocking on the window as if she had something to tell me. I didn't know what to expect, but I decided to roll down the window to find out what she wanted. I thought maybe she would explain why she had been staring at me for so long. To my surprise, she held up a $20 bill and said that I had dropped it. I was extremely confused because I was sure that I hadn't dropped a $20 bill. I asked her if she was sure, and she said yes. She had seen me drop it in the parking lot. I didn't even think I had any $20 bills on me, and I rarely carried much cash. By now, I was 99% sure she was lying. I told her firmly, no, that's not mine, but the woman didn't back off. She continued holding the bill out to me, with her head almost inside my car and her hand just a couple of feet away from me. When I told her again that the bill wasn't mine, she didn't pull back. Instead, she started to crawl through the window and into my car. The whole situation was bizarre. At that moment, I made a quick decision. I immediately turned off the engine and took the keys out of the ignition. I got out of my car and started walking away quickly, but the woman had already gotten inside. I felt a surge of panic and realized I needed to act fast. I moved further from the car, took out my phone, and called the police. I stood there, watching my car from a distance, and after about a minute, I saw the woman climb out of the car and run off. I returned to my car, got inside, locked the doors, and waited for the police to arrive. When they showed up, I explained what had happened. But by that time, the woman was already gone. I told them everything, but I couldn't explain why she did what she did. She didn't steal anything from inside my car, though I didn't have anything valuable there. Maybe she had intended to steal the car itself, or somehow force me to drive her somewhere. I have no idea what she was really trying to do. After that incident, I went home, and I haven't seen that woman since.